right, let's kick things off, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. I myself sit on Bunurong country, but I know our panelists and people who are in the audience here are all over Australia. So we want to recognise that these have always been lands where learning has taken place through storytelling and the sharing of experiences. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. My name's Anthony, and on behalf of CIM, I want to welcome you to today's webinar, where we're going to explore the shift towards data-driven maintenance, what it is, how it's been approached by industry leaders, and what it means for your operations. As we go through today, if you have any questions, please put them through in the Q&A, but using the Q&A button on the webinar software. Please, when you do give us a question, let us know who that's for. And if you are planning to ask Scott a question, can you please be specific about CIM Scott and GPT Scott? Because just to make my life fun, we've got two people with the same name on the panel. We're going to rename Jeremy to Scott as well, but we decided not to do that today. So with that, we've got Scott Crellin, who's the National Director for General Property Operations at GPT. Jeremy Underwood, Senior Engineering and Operations Manager at JLL. And Scott Beauman, who's the Global Head of Customer Success from our host today, the leading building analytics provider, CIM. So, and I haven't clicked through my slides, which is very naughty of me, isn't it? So let me just quickly do that. So, yeah, we've got Scott, Jeremy, and Scott, and the agenda for today is that we're going to look at the traditional approach to maintenance, benefits of DDM or data-driven maintenance, and considerations when implementing DDM, and the look ahead. And we're going to try to take as many of your questions as we can. If we don't get to your specific question, please rest assured that we have noted them all down and that we will try to follow them up after the webinar where we can. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Scott Beauman from CIM, and he's going to walk us through a presentation around the topic of data-driven maintenance in commercial buildings. Welcome, Scott.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Anthony. Hopefully you guys can see my screen at the moment. Yep.
Gotcha.
Thank you for the thumbs up. Yeah, cool. So look, I'll just jump in, obviously for everyone that's joined, a quick introduction to data-driven maintenance. So kicking off with what is data-driven maintenance? I think for me, specifically, and obviously the experience that I have, right, it really represents a fundamental shift in the way that we run our buildings. As I'm sure many of you know, traditional, planned preventive maintenance has been around for a long time, and we're really seeing actually a big move away from that tick and flick style, preventative maintenance schedules where you come in and you have a look at, this level this month and that level the next month, right? And I think, ERA does a pretty great job of, just minimize this, sorry. A pretty great job of explaining it, right? It's simply, changing maintenance, disrupting the traditional practices, and we're seeing a lot of new sort of value opportunities being created off the back of that. I just click to the next slide. If we jump in under the hood a little bit, what it kind of looks like in practice, I've just extracted a quick example of rules, and obviously we're an FTD platform, but extracted a sample. FTD rules and with a specific reference to those that we think apply to data-driven maintenance. So this allows obviously a bit of prioritization, a determination of what's included, whether it's maintenance scope, call-out scope, what the impact is, if it's energy, comfort, reliability related, as well as the priority, right? So being able to easily understand whether or not something is kind of critical or urgent, in terms of triaging how quickly we need to kind of action this sort of stuff. The current approach, I think, is quite an interesting topic, and we're obviously going to dive into that quite a lot today, right? But it's quite varied as well. There's a broad range of kind of strategies that the industry is pursuing at the moment. As I said, I've got them up here at the top. So the first one there is do nothing. Obviously, a little bit to our disappointment. But a lot of people are choosing this, right? It's basically maintaining the status quo, right? So keeping the existing BMS mechanical alignments and contracts, no integration of any analytics or additional reporting tools. Obviously, what we're all kind of coming to realize is that there's a lot of missed opportunity there, right? A lot of missed opportunity in terms of efficiency of maintenance contracts and the way maintenance is performed, but also in terms of energy consumption, things like that. And we're seeing a lot of high operational risk effectively. The second one, which is kind of where a lot of people are at, actually, is kind of that implementation without alignment, right? We're kind of calling this partial DDM. So, they're implementing an analytics or an FDD tool, as an overlay to their current kind of maintenance practices, but they're not really integrating the findings or integrating the workflows, into contractor scopes. It's not being managed, super directly, and as a result, we're sort of seeing insights are ignored. The ROI is, half there or not there at all, and it's heavily dependent, on the individual service vendors themselves, right? And I don't mean the individual companies; I actually mean the individual technicians and the individual facilities teams that are on the ground. The last one there is kind of full contractual alignment, right? And that's, I guess, what we're really kind of talking about today, right? That is, full data-driven maintenance, right? This is where we're seeing quite a lot more, and quite a lot more recently in the industry. People, owners and operators, basically rewriting, renegotiating maintenance contracts, maintenance agreements, incorporating findings from analytics, incorporating, the data into those workflows, right? And there's a lot of benefits. Obviously, we believe in that, the accountability, the continuous improvement, clear objectives, right? And kind of deciding on what's important for this building, and really just establishing a framework around the current practice, right? It's really solidifying the whole industry. So in terms of, what that's like in the actual field, right? This, as an example, this is the kind of terminology, this is the kind of the way in which, large building owners are sort of thinking about it, right? Taking this from a scope. And look, it kind of says it there on the page, right, in the highlight. By leveraging the By leveraging the capabilities in an AFD platform, we're minimizing the scope of maintenance providers, serving increased number of assets, putting aside the routine tasks and the scheduled tasks, and freeing up time for focus on higher value activities, right? There's always going to be a requirement to do code compliance activities. For example, you're always going to have to make sure your condensed water dosing is up to date and the chemical balance is right. But switching some of those lower value activities into the higher value activities really leads to kind of improved outcomes across the board for the buildings themselves, right? What we've done, we've actually gone and had a bit of a look and kind of modeled out the examples. So this is straight off the back of the ERA DA19 BMS scope, and had a look at what changes can be made and how that actually affects the specific line items, right? So of the 60 or 70 or so individual actions that you're kind of required to do under the ERA DA19, best practice. We found that nearly half of those can be removed or reduced with the support of analytics and the support of a data-driven approach to the way you maintain your contracts and the way you maintain your buildings effectively, right? So that comes in two different things. So obviously reducing the cadence kind of completely. So activities going from quarterly to annual, from quarterly to 6 months. Things moving out from a yearly check to a every other year check. But also in terms of removing these things entirely, right? So things that were, previously monthly checks, such as checking temperature sensors on every floor, that sort of stuff can actually just be removed, and you can wholly and solely rely on the analytics and the data-driven approach to alert you to these things, and as a result, see some quite big changes to your maintenance structure, your maintenance agreements, the costs to kind of service those as well. Obviously, there's no such thing as a free lunch, right? And look, I don't want to steal anyone's thunder. These are the sorts of things that Scott and Jeremy will obviously be talking about as well today. But really, if we kind of put a couple up there in terms of what needs to be thought about and the risks you kind of need to mitigate against when you're starting down this path, starting down this approach to changing the way you've been running your building for the last 40 or 50 years, making sure you have availability of the data. As I said, bringing the FM team and the building operations team along for the ride, considering how this impacts the maintenance contracts and the maintenance agreements that you already have. One of the big benefits, and obviously also one of the challenges, is then scaling these insights across the portfolio, right? So things you're finding out, one building, how does that apply to the rest of my portfolio? But I think a lot of this can sort of become overcome and certainly managed against with clearly defined objectives, right? So, look, that's it from me. Just a bit of a high level intro into how we think about data-driven maintenance at CIM. But I'll stop sharing and I'll hand back to Anthony to kick us off.
Thanks, Scott. That was really, really helpful, just to get us going and to put a bit of context around the conversation we're going to have today. Let's have a bit of a chat now around the traditional approach to maintenance. So, Scott from GPT, from your experience, what are some of the key shortcomings of traditional maintenance models, such as just planned preventative or unplanned maintenance? Just need to unmute. There you go. Oh, no, we still don't have you.
Got me now?
Got you now.
I think it was muted on your end and my end. So sorry about that. Sorry, everybody.
That wasn't me. I promise that wasn't me.
No worries. Thank you for the question. It's good. And Scott, I think you've got a couple of slides there that'll be really interesting for later. I think when you look at both from a planned preventative maintenance and a unplanned maintenance, I think there's general limitations over both. What all of our buildings have is the ability to leverage like IoT sensors and predictive analytics. And the problem with traditional maintenance, in a sense, is that it's highly prescriptive. So those traditional maintenance specifications actually don't consider, the technology that we've all probably largely got embedded in our assets. So on that basis, and it means our maintenance programs, they're not based on historical performance or patterns of degradation. So it doesn't get considered, which obviously then just has a direct knock-on impact into all of our cost base, whether it's through over-servicing or unplanned breakdowns or limited asset lifecycle extension. So for me, having access to that data, getting a line of sight over what's going on, to Scott's point earlier, it actually allows us to look at our maintenance models and our performance specifications that we have and change those so that we're leveraging, those data insights, and we become, not only a data-led decision-making company, but we're using, also data-led procurement as well.
Thanks, Scott. So, Jeremy, you've had quite a long career, and you've spent your early part of your career getting your hands dirty and working as a technician. How have perceptions around maintenance changed over that time from when you started to today?
Yeah, no, a lot. Showing my age, in my apprenticeship, I did actually do some maintenance on pneumatic control systems. So, back then, on pneumatics, hey, you had to do every month, adjust this, adjust that, do that. And that's just the way it was. And there wasn't a lot of data coming back from that. Luckily enough, I was actually in a controls technician. So I was actually in the space of being able to actually get into some DDC and programming. And that's where you could really see the bones of what you could do. Now, back in the mid to late 90s, a lot of the precursor of the analytics packages we were sort of trying to develop, but the big thing that we're limited with there was memory space on the actual DDCs themselves. There's only so many lines of code you could actually write. But luckily in the early 2000s, memory suddenly became not that much of an issue, and suddenly the processing and the data that these devices could actually store, track, that we could then analyze down the track became a lot better. And that's when we could start to really see the benefits of, well, we don't really need to be adjusting these thermostats, or these different devices on a month-to-month basis, but we can look at, hey, first of all, how are things failing? Let's instead of looking at, all right, does this temperature sensor, is it out of calibration? What we can look at is the plant performing to what it was a month ago? And suddenly we're looking at a more of a holistic state. As we've moved forward, that's become even more smarter and even better. When I first started getting into the FM game, probably going on almost 10 years ago now, we still had the traditional models for maintenance, but we're starting to incorporate an allocation of hours every month that was what we could do as FMs. Okay, we know that something's happening here. We can sort of see a bit of a trend happening here, and instead of just having X amount of hours that you've got a set PPM that you've got to tick off, well, this many hours, all right, we're going to focus on this because I know that we're always getting temperature complaints here, or we're always getting a water leak here. So we can start to focus it. And then it's definitely these days getting into more of a dynamic model. We're finding that definitely from a BMS side of things, the BMS contracts don't need to be as fixed and rigid on this is what we're doing. We've got great automation systems. I'm speaking quite generally here, not all sites do, but we've got some great automation systems that tell us when things go wrong. Like if something fails, we'll know about it. And so we don't need that. And then we've got all of these trend logs set up so we can start to see when things are starting to go out of alignment, things are starting to sort of fail. So it really allows us from a maintenance perspective to be a lot more predictive. And this also gives us a better insight into lifespan of equipment too. The traditional model is a lot of times, unless you're doing invasive or like vibration analysis or thermoscans and stuff like that, it's really tricky to really get to know the lifespan of some of the plant and equipment. But now we can start to see long-term trends. Over a couple of years, you can start to see performance. You can start to see, all right, this plant is now using more 15% more energy than what it was 3 years ago. Why is that? And we're getting a lot better and a lot more focused on being able to set up our maintenance, but also then obviously our plant life cycle replacements moving forward. And the owners are really appreciative of that.
Awesome. That's really great. And being able to lean back on that experience right through the, literally from soup to nuts all the way through, that's been really, really helpful. So Scott, from CIM, you guys get around a whole bunch of different organizations and you work with across a lot of different buildings and property owners and portfolio managers and so forth. Can you talk to us a bit about some real world examples where legacy maintenance practices have actually led to problems, led to issues?
Yeah, look, I mean, I kind of got, how long do we have? I mean, I can kind of talk about this, all day. Obviously, I've maybe a
I'll
little
give
bit
you
biased.
3 minutes.
Maybe a little bit biased, but no, this is something, me and my team come across every day, right? As I said, the traditional way of doing maintenance, and, Jeremy spoke about it it made a lot of sense when there was pneumatics, right? And there was literally tubes of air running all through your building, right? That had a tendency of popping off. And that is just not how buildings are run and how buildings are constructed and how buildings are kind of operated anymore, right? So we have, countless of examples. A simple one, came up earlier this week, where the building we're working with, they're currently going through that planned preventive maintenance style. They're going through looking at one level at a time. And as a result, we've seen this air handling unit that was just, valve has been leaking, right? Where the chilled water valve there is not seated properly. The actuator's not kind of sitting on, and nobody's doing anything about it, right? And it's just literally money down the drain, right? That sort of stuff, is super easy to find with a data-led approach and an analytics platform kind of sitting across the top of your building and eyes and ears on it all the time, right? So as I said, that is a fairly simple example, right? But one that we see, almost week in, week out, across the buildings and across the various owners. And there's, no one BMS or no one owner or no one facility manager or no one company that's kind of worse at that. I think that's just, an accepted, unfortunately, kind of legacy issue that we have at the moment.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I know that when I first, the first few times I spoke to Dave, who's the founder of CIM, and when he and I spoke, he talked about having that. It's like having an MRI on all the time that can pick up every niggle and let you know when that's on. And it really is having that visibility is the key thing here. It's been able to see things so you can act on them. Just before we go on to the next question, I just want to remind everyone in the audience, if you do have questions, put them through the Q&A and let us know who they're for. really, really helpful for us if you do that. So, Scott from GPT, I'm going to ask each of you this same question now, but from your viewpoint, what have been some of the big benefits of adopting a data-driven maintenance model? Obviously, you're coming from owning it, as a building owner from that perspective. What's been the big benefit for you there?
I think for us, it's all about competitive advantage at the end of the day, right? So, in order to be able to keep your buildings leased up and occupied, we've got to have spaces that are highly productive, suit the needs of our tenant. But, from a tenant's perspective, what makes that attractive is, well, really, it's their cost of, the whole cost of occupancy. So, if we're spending a lot of money on maintenance and it's just prescriptive maintenance, but we're not getting a return out of that, you're just sort of ticking boxes, but there's no value, then the reality is, your buildings aren't going to be optimized from a cost-based perspective. You're going to be paying overs, because you're over servicing, or you're getting, breakdowns that you couldn't predict or foresee, which means you've just got cost basically walking out the door. There's money on the table there. So I think for me, having be able to access that data and having that those data-led insights means we can get ahead of it. Means we can optimize the way that we're running our building services. We can get highly accurate in terms of our budget and forecasting, so we know what we've got to spend where, which again is really crucial, for our tenancies. And you get better operational efficiency out of it, across the board. And like I said, all that ultimately has to lead to you having a competitive advantage. And what I would say, particularly in some of our assets and our premium grade assets, where we can do that, and we do that really well, we do have operating expenses that are less than our competitors. So that's a compelling proposition. And from an owner's perspective, arguably for every dollar you can drive out of operating expenses, if you can put that back into rent and capitalize it up, then your building's worth more. You're getting a better return out of the investment that we've got our money parked in. So, and the other thing I'd touch on too is obviously compliance as well. I think for me, one of the things I do like about data-driven maintenance is we can get ahead of those things that are compliance related before they actually become issues for us. So, so they would be my main things that I see as benefit, but really trying to drive that competitive advantage.
I think.
What about from your perspective, Jeremy?
Yeah,
Sorry.
I think, well, also from Scott would benefit a lot from this, that we see from a portfolio level, generally from a lot of this data-driven maintenance. Aligned packages means that Scott can look at his whole portfolio, and look at how the buildings are performance. And so, you can start to really and we see this from a client perspective as well. A lot of our clients want us to work together with a certain package, which is identical across their portfolio. And that's not an FM company thing. I've worked with a lot of different FM companies for a single client portfolio, and we've aligned all of our systems to be able to report back at a portfolio level. So that's a really big one as well. But definitely from an asset perspective, the big thing that everybody's looking for now is efficiency, not just energy efficiency, water efficiency, cost effective stuff like that. But we've found that definitely over the last sort of 4 or 5 years, our monthly HVAC meeting, if you like, is not a HVAC meeting anymore. This is a building tuning meeting. And these are more important than, a monthly maintenance meeting. They'll send us through a monthly report and tell us, what they've ticked off and what they've found, what invoices we've got to pay. That's fine. That's all fine in a report. But our monthly meetings are becoming more targeted and more beneficial. So we can look at, hey, this is the information we've got, and this is how we move it forward. And a lot of our building tuning meetings that we've had on some of our sites, a tuning meeting is not just, us and the HVAC and the BMS contractor. We'll have the plumbers in there as well for their part. We'll have the electricians in there, they've got lighting controls and that. How can you improve from your side of things? So, definitely our monthly meetings are becoming a lot more focused, which is actually better for everyone. From an FM perspective, it's better for us because we can have one meeting with everybody there and then just get our monthly reports and sort of touch base on those sorts of things. So we can actually sort of reduce our time that we're spending on our traditional meetings and our traditional sort of maintenance proposals, purely because we've got all this information, got all this data, and the way all the systems work together now, that everybody's part of it, and we tend to find that we get a wider team. Everybody's sort of like invested in their part. Because they're involved in the whole building. We'll have the electricians in there, and all right, they're not much to do with the hydraulics or the air conditioning, but they're listening to that, and they actually feel part of the asset, and people feel proud of what they do when they're doing it. So it actually creates a better space. So when we do have, everything's connected now, so when we do have the different trades that are adding the data to this system, everybody's talking. The electricians are talking to the BMS contractors because we need a HLI to talk to their systems. Even the plumbers are connecting systems. So we're getting a better, from an FM perspective, we're definitely getting a better team of people to be able to look at our building, and everybody's got their own bits to add to how we can make the building more efficient.
Thanks for that. I was just going to ask Scott from GPT, we just actually had an audience question for you, if you wouldn't mind me jumping in with it. Are there any major differences in implementing a data-driven approach when you're comparing office spaces to retail?
Yeah, there are. So we're obviously across office, industrial, and retail, and I would say there's three very different businesses. Retail is consumer-facing. Office is very much a service business, and logistics is logistics and manufacturing. I think when it comes to, particularly in office, there's certainly greater expectation around your spatial environment conditions. You're dealing with a lot of high-end, like law firms or really large multinational companies, and they're paying good freight, right? So they expect. They don't want downtime, and they don't want inconsistency because it disrupts their business. I would say retail can be a little bit more flexible in that space. You've got 500 tenants. You've got greater diversity in terms of the type of plant that you've got installed. But I would also say it's probably a little bit less critical. For me, as an example, if I lose a lift in a commercial building, that's a problem. Whereas, if I lose a lift in a retail setting, there's escalators or there's other ways of navigating it. So they do have different drivers and different considerations for sure. Yeah.
Thanks for that. And just Jeremy, when you're speaking to smaller owners about how receptive are they to implementing a data-driven approach to maintenance?
Oh, very much so, because it generally represents a cost saving from a maintenance perspective as well. So yeah, we can incorporate this. Because it's a tailored maintenance contract, if you like, we can start to really take out the bulk of what we don't need to be doing, or even potentially widen out some of the stock standard PPM type stuff, because we've got other systems that can report back on the performance of the plant. And especially when it comes, everybody wants, obviously, like I mentioned, sustainability, efficiency out of their building, and that a lot of times can come at a cost. Getting consultants in, getting specific sustainability people in. But when you're adding in an analytic package, suddenly you've got this really powerful tool at a reasonably low cost, outlay, to be able to provide a massive amount of data across the building. So from a smaller owner's perspective, I know, not all of them have been able to take that step, but it's definitely worth looking into these type of packages to piggyback over the top of a BMS system. Most of them sit on a BMS network, so they don't need to be incorporated into a particular brand, and they read the database and can get all the data and information that way. So it's a really cost-effective way of being able to get the best performance, and definitely look at plants, run times, life cycle, and that sort of stuff to really reduce your cost, but also then project costs as well.
Thanks for that. So Scott from CIM, just from your perspective, what have been some of the big benefits that you've seen around adopting this data-driven maintenance model?
Yeah, look, I mean, I don't know that I honestly have too much to add to what Scott and Jeremy already put out there, right? And I think I really like the way they kind of framed it, right? You know, it's for me, I kind of believe it's just a much better way to run buildings, right? And that rolls up into all those benefits, right? We see the time effectiveness, you know, of moving, you know, really kind of experienced people and experienced technicians moving their time away from low value, low impact tasks to the higher value, high impact tasks. And that really manifests itself, as I said, in better performing buildings, right? You're able to be much more strategic. You're able to scale those insights, as Jeremy said, you know, across a portfolio. And I think probably my favorite line there was what Scott said, right? Ultimately, that rolls up into a competitive advantage. I wish I had thought of that a little bit earlier myself.
Oh, that's great. So, just speaking about Scott at CPM, let's talk a little bit about some of the considerations when you're actually moving towards a data-driven maintenance approach. Scott, what are some of the risks or friction points that you've seen when transitioning service vendors into a DDM environment? And maybe how have you got around them or through them?
I would say it's an ongoing challenge. So, for a couple of reasons, and there's probably two sort of key reasons, and then there's probably a couple that sit underneath it. But first and foremost, there's a resistance to change, right? So, BMS providers are probably a clear case in point. Sorry, Jeremy. But you know, if we're saying, hey, we're going to move to reading sensors and we can do 40% of the maintenance less efficiency because we don't need people, well, that's an impact on their ability to generate profit, right? It's a reality because there is a margin on obviously labor. But I think from my perspective, that's not the intent. It's not to do away with the labor. It's just about doing things smarter. And I think in some ways, BMS companies have had pretty much a Kodak moment. I think they've been literally caught sleeping at the wheel. But I mean, I see the same thing with mechanical providers, right? So, for example, GPT, we're tendering MEC at the moment. We've got a really prescriptive scope of services that's based on DA19A. But as part of our tender process, we're saying, where does technology come into play? What tech stack do you have? How can you have a competitive advantage to be able to deliver and meet the objectives of DA19A in a really cost-effective way? And you know what? There's companies that have invested heavily that are going to be able to, be at the forefront of that decision, and there'll be others that'll be completely frustrated by it. So, and it's going to be hard to compete. So we see when we structure these things up, and being a case in point, when we've brought CIM into our portfolio, we saw instant resistance from other providers, right? It's like, what are you doing in our backyard? So you've got to align with partners that are open-minded, that understand where the future's going. Because the reality is, for property industry, all of our maintenance is going to be data-driven maintenance. It's going to be and data-led procurement. And if you're not on that journey now, then the reality is you're not going to be relevant in 10 years' time. I think the other thing that's really problematic is then the change in contractual dynamics. So, that shift from output-based, tick the box, I've done all these tasks, to performance-based and uptime, and then how you measure that, and some of the debate that you get around either how you're incentivizing your contractors or how you're resolving disputes over those, data-led performance metrics. We've seen some of that. I think there's another side to it as well, though, with increased tech stack, and obviously it's who owns the data. And we had a dispute with one provider in particular during COVID about just wanting access to data, and it's like, well, it's not your data, which was interesting. And then over that, you've obviously got the whole cybersecurity vulnerabilities as well that you've got to address, and all of those things need to be addressed in a contractual sense. You've got to be really clear up front. But I think the way you get around and the way you take people on that journey, you've got to select partners that are on the same page. You've got to be aligned in your values. They've got to understand your business. They've got to want to help you drive your competitive advantage and see themselves as an extension of your business, not as a competitor to your business.
Yeah, we've seen that too, Scott. Definitely, when we've used other analytics packages which are aligned with other maintenance companies, and then you bring them into a site where you've got somebody else doing the maintenance. Yeah, there's definitely been a lot of pushback. But what I've found is, like I mentioned earlier, with having the tuning meetings, where everybody's involved and everybody gets a say in it, that tends to sort of break down those barriers. Yeah, but the barriers are definitely there. I'm not 100% they are. So it's definitely one of the big challenges. The big thing that we find, obviously, if companies aren't, already, don't have a comprehensive sort of database or network, internet-based system, the biggest challenge that we've got from a building perspective is, how do you get the data? How do you get the systems on board? Converged networks obviously are the way we're moving towards. But not all buildings have them. And even the ones that do have them are sort of maybe a pseudo converged network, or it's the BMS network that everybody's just jumped on. And so trying to get, which is a good way to get a bones of it, but definitely one of the changes that we find from an FM perspective is we need to let the BMS companies do what they do, and that is controls, and they're very good at it. But then from our perspective, what we try to do is we say, right, we're going to own the network. And that's a big challenge. It's a big change in ethos. So we own the network that they sit on. And we then have to control that. We then have to maintain the network. And suddenly we've got extra costs elsewhere. So yes, we're still paying these BMS companies, still paying these MET companies exactly what they want, because they don't want to go on into a less value contract, as you say. But suddenly we've got an extra cost in our IT, and being able to manage the network, and how we get the data together. And that's a trick. It's a challenge. And part of that comes in the outlay. Scott will tell you that the outlay, or Scott Beauman will tell you that the outlay for a software package to be able to do this is fairly cheap, fairly reasonable. But there's a lot of infrastructure behind it from our end that we have to then put in place to make it a useful product. The big thing is utilizing the networks that we have on site and being able to have the expertise, and then let's just throw in a cybersecurity overlay over the top of that, and then it then becomes even more challenging to be able to do these things. But look, we've from our perspective, we've done it on a few different sites now. We've taken some older sites with BMS networks, commandeered them, and converted them into a converged network, and then had newer sites with really good ones, which makes it really easy. But you've still then got the IT guys who then have to have set up VLANs, set up data transfer between the VLANs, manage ports, all that sort of stuff. So there is a cost to be able to have the good data and make sure that the right data is getting through.
That's a really good lead in for Scott from CIM. When you're assessing the readiness of a portfolio for DDM, what are you looking for?
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, it's data, right? Like data-driven maintenance. You can't do data-driven maintenance without the data, right? I think, yeah, exactly what Jeremy said. There are, kind of older buildings still out there, still exist that don't necessarily have, all the right infrastructure and all the right kind of tooling already available on site to facilitate this. I guess what kind of excites me is those buildings are getting less and less, right? Those buildings are being upgraded, those buildings are being replaced. Things are happening kind of constantly, right? So until you can kind of, be sure of getting that data out, and you can't make any insights, right? There's nothing to, kind of direct a technician to do if you don't have any information coming out of the building, right? So first and foremost, that is really what you need. I think secondly, and probably, equally important though, if you're assessing a building for data readiness, you're really kind of assessing the readiness of the organization and the team that are going to be doing this, right? So, thankfully we've got, organizations like GPT and people like Scott Crellin that, want to push this sort of stuff forward, right? And ultimately it's, the big end of town that usually sort of drive this sort of stuff. And, we end up seeing it sort of flowing through the industry, right? But that piece, and we've kind of been talking about in the last few minutes, right? The hearts and minds and making sure that change management piece, is kind of there at the beginning, really has a big impact on whether or not this will be successful, right?
Awesome. So, Scott from GPT, we've got another audience question for you. Someone's said here that they're restructuring their service contract. In your experience, which level within DA19 do you see as the minimum? Is it level A, something else?
Yeah, well, I can talk for where GPT sits, but yeah, so we're DA19A. Yeah, that's where we want to be. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks for that. So let's look ahead a little bit. While you've got the mic, Scott, the virtual mic, Scott from GPT, with the advancements we're seeing in AI, machine learning, automation, how do you see owner expectations evolving over the next few years when it comes to smarter and more predictive maintenance?
It's a good question. I would say without a doubt, it comes back to my first point. We want to be the one that the tenants come to, right? We want spaces that are highly optimal for them. So I would say for us, we don't really have a choice in this, right? Because we've got to run our buildings better on less. Right? It's just the world we're living in. But I think the technology is there to do it. And I think the rate of change that we're going to see in this space over the next few years will accelerate. So I think for me, it's about being clear on what that change looks like, and what your tech stack needs to be. And Jeremy made a really good point earlier, and I sort of didn't touch on it, but there is a high upfront cost to set up your buildings properly to be able to get this right, because you do need networks and you do need storage areas, and your data needs to be structured. There's a whole bunch of stuff that complicates it. But I think what you've got to do is you've got to understand what your foundational technology baseline is. Like, what does that tech stack actually look like? How do you how do you integrate it? You've got to make sure it's all obviously scalable as your business ebbs and flows in its size. All those things. It's interesting. Everyone talks about AI, and AI is not there yet for me. But do I think it'll come? Absolutely. And so we're watching it really, really closely, because if I go back to BMS is great. It holds your base strategy. But the one thing that a BMS can't do is almost like dynamic strategy. So an example I'll use is through machine learning and data, you'll learn that your building's got a thermal mass of 2 hours. So rather than wait to wind back a cool change or wind back your set points for a cool change that's going to arrive in 2 hours, if your building's got a thermal mass of 2 hours, how do you use AI to drive down your plant equipment now, so you're getting that really maximum energy benefit? That's where I see the role of AI is going to play. So in my mind, you're going to need a BMS, you're going to need an analytics platform, and you're going to need an AI platform over the top of all of it.
Sorry, just on that one, Scott. Also, furthering on from that, away from sort of the HVAC type thing, one of the things that we've sort of used is analytics within cameras, people counting cameras. And this can assist in obviously building occupancy, and it then can assist a lot of times, depending on where you've got you can get traffic flows, data flow, and where people are going. So if they're always, that there's a lot of people on level 10, level 11, what we can do is we can have that data fed back to our cleaning crew. So we know that our cleaning crews are probably going to have to visit the amenities higher today than what they did yesterday, because I don't know, these guys have an event happening and they've got 50% more people there. So we know that the toilet racks are going to need to be refreshed cleaner. So it's a different type of thing. And there's some really good camera systems out there to be able to do this. They can do demographic tracking as well, so we know where who's coming into the not necessarily who's, not facial recognition, it's completely away from that, but are we getting a lot more people into the male toilets for this particular area, or into the female toilets? And so you can almost tend to customize some of your cleaning contracts then. And so it's a difference into what we're traditionally talking about, data-driven maintenance, but we're now talking about service maintenance as well. And it allows us to do things like that. We can, from a plant perspective, if you've got a bank of hot water units, well, I know on a Friday, the building population is only running at 30% because still nobody comes in on Fridays. Well, I can turn off a couple of banks of my hot water units on a Friday because I know that what's going to be left over can actually handle the building load. And there's a few things that are, this is early days of this sort of stuff, but we've been able to get a lot of good data from just camera management. We haven't sort of fully implemented that back through to the full system, but on a couple of sites that I've worked on, we've been getting some really good data just from that type of a thing and how the buildings operate on a day-to-day basis.
It's a really awesome point you make, Jeremy, because probably most of us on the call all think about this in a mech and elect sense, right? It's because that's where most of the efficiency is derived, but it's so much bigger than that. Like it's all of your connected technology. So if I take a retail shopping center environment, right, we can predict where people are going to be. We know where they park. We know what doors they're coming through. We've got analytics over over the camera system, so we can see where spills are. So if you think about buildings in a live environment, the thing you need to optimize the way you run that building is access to the data, and then you need to be able to have technology that gives you those insights, so that you make the right informed decisions. And that's the key to all of this in my mind. It's having access to the data in a structured way, where at the end of the day, you don't need the technical experts running your buildings, because if you've got the right systems and platforms and data and you've structured it, it'll give you the answers to the challenges that you're going to face. And I think that for me, the operations managers of today, the questions they need to ask themselves is, what is the problem I'm trying to solve, and what data do I have access to solve it? And I've seen some incredible examples in our business where things that we've assumed on assets, where we go, this is what we think the problem is, and then we go and ask the question of our data, and we've got some internal data scientists within our business. We ask them, hey, this is our problem, and then the answer we get back is completely different to what we thought. And it's awesome, because that then tells you where you need to spend your money, and you make so much smarter investment decisions based on that. So Jeremy's point's really valid. It's data across anything.
Well, you raise a good point too, is that, one thing I've found is, given my background, I'd love to bury myself in a BMS all day, every day, and, analyze it, do all this and do all that, but I just don't have time. I've got other things to do. But what I'm finding is that it's giving me the data, so I don't need to do that, which then frees me up to do other things. So from a management perspective, I can do more. The more data you've got, like you said, I did take umbrage to one point that you didn't need the technical FMs anymore.
I've got to say, I did see you squirm in the seat a little bit.
I'll probably get shot later if there's any GPT.
But you're correct. Like if the data is there, you don't need somebody with my background sitting there analyzing everything and producing reports. The reports are already produced for you. And so, that is a good thing.
But it goes to your point as well, Jeremy. It's not that we don't need people like you. It just means your time and energy then is spent on looking at what's coming at us over the horizon, and how do we prepare for it. So we actually start to utilize your skill in a much more informed way.
So we start, I start looking at energy efficiency. All right, how are we going to get into a electrified building? How are we going to do the best out of our life cycle replacements? That's the things that I can focus on, rather than focusing on has this air handling unit got a passing heating valve?
Yeah. So just on the looking ahead into the future, Scott from CIM, are you allowed to? Hopefully, you can tell us a few secrets about what's going on, behind the front door at CIM. But can you talk to us a little bit about maybe some of the innovations and product developments that are in the pipeline to support this next generation of data-driven maintenance?
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, for me, that's where it's kind of exciting, right? Like we have, a lot of these tools, and I would say, like, in terms of using AI to do, data-driven maintenance, I would probably argue a little bit that is actually already happening, right? Systems like ours are, kind of expert systems, AI systems, looking at these building operations, 24/7, right? That sort of stuff is already happening. Where I kind of get, a little bit excited is thinking about that, more of a predictive kind of maintenance route, and we have examples of that, as I said, not all the way solved or all the way down the future, but we have examples of that happening. Today I was talking with one of our engineers internally, And they're looking at things, cooling tower VSDs, right? Kind of simple. There's clearly an issue with them. We've got them running, all 6 towers all in a big cooling tower bank, but all drawing, running at the same frequency and all drawing different powers, all drawing different torques, all having different, kilowatts. So being able to kind of trend that and analyze that and understand that kind of system performance, right? And actually realize that, hey, 2 of ththese towers, the V-belts have gone, right? These fans are not actually driving. These towers the VSDs are running, but they're just, almost freewheeling, right? So being able to do that kind of analysis on a more scalable way, I think at the moment, that is still a little bit manually driven and does require a little bit of expertise from an engineer perhaps. So, extending that, and that's the sort of stuff that really excites me, what's sort of coming down our pipeline, right? Being able to leverage those insights and scale those insights across every building.
One of the things I'll just add to that for a sec is I don't think we'll get to a world, though. I'd hate for this to come across as though, buildings going to be run by robots because, and just systems, because they're not. Like, you're still going to need technicians. They're still,
100%.
work that technicians will need to do. But I think it's, again, what we were talking about earlier, I think it's the value of that work that changes. It goes from medial, low value work with some elements to actually the complete opposite. So I still think, you still need to get eyes, ears and hands on equipment.
Absolutely.
Oh, definitely.
You can also introduce, like, definitely from an FM perspective, you can introduce different people, you don't need a person with a technical background. And I've met FMs out there who don't have my background, the technical background, and they're brilliant. I definitely, a lot of the best FMs I know don't have technical backgrounds. They've got other backgrounds, and they can look at other ways of managing the contractors, or managing budgets and things like that, or tenant expectations. Like, these FMs are brilliant at this sort of stuff that, me sitting in a plant room with my head in a BMS is, not very good for customer service. But, look, it opens up the industry to different people who have different insights as well. And that's been really good to be able to have the data that, you used to need somebody like me sitting there analyzing, producing reports, but you don't need that anymore. So suddenly you've got, these very smart people who look at things completely differently, offering in, hey, we could use this data by doing this. We can use the data by doing that. And, so suddenly it opens up building management into a whole different way that, from a traditional technical perspective, we never even saw coming.
We're coming close to the end of our time, and there's one more audience question I'd really love to get to. And this is for Scott from GPT. I thought we were going to get through a webinar about building maintenance and efficiency and energy efficiency without saying ESG, but we've got an ESG question for you, Scott. Does this new approach to maintenance support your ESG goals, particularly in areas like Scope 1 and 2 emissions and neighbours improvements? And just along those lines, are your ESG teams on board with these new approaches?
Short answer is yes to all of it. So yeah, 100% they are. So I think everything that we do in this space is about reducing wastage, right? In all forms. So and in turn reducing obviously our footprint, but also our operating expenses, which then becomes attractive to tenants. Like if you've got say you've got 2 buildings and they're both rated neighbours 5-star, well, and say they're equally as compelling in terms of amenity. I still think at the end of the day, the person that's making a decision, at least that floor space, is going, well, what's the outgoings cost? Like, and how is that building being run? Because you have 2 buildings 5-star, but the outgoings can be completely different. So to answer that question in simple sense, yes, absolutely. And I'm a big supporter of our sustainability team. So it's certainly gone through some recent changes. But I would say the reason that GPT, is leaders in most sustainability indexes is because there is that alignment, and it does flow right down through to the strategies that we then implement on the ground in the assets.
Yeah, we've just on that too. We've had a few packages where we actually have, it's almost live neighbours tracking data where you can actually, all the information is going back through our analytics package, and you put it onto a nice graphic screen with nice colored dials and how you're going. But basically you can see in real time from a neighbor's perspective how your building's performing. And that type of stuff is great, not just for improving, but also for reducing the risk if something goes wrong. If you get a massive water leak, you can lose a half a star in water real easily. Whereas if you've got an analytics package that's monitoring that, if you don't see it yourself, hopefully it'll send through an alarm. It'll identify that something's happened and alert somebody, and you can jump onto these things real quick. So it's not just about improving your ESG credentials, but it's about protecting the ones that you've already got too.
Great point. Yeah.
Oh, you're on
I
mute.
think you're on mute, Anthony.
There we go. Sorry, clicked on the wrong button. One very last question before we wrap things up for today, and this is it's one for everyone, and because we've only got a couple of minutes left, I'm going to try to get you each trying to answer this in 30 seconds or less each. So let's see how we go with that. And I'm going to start with Jeremy first. What are some of your recommendations on how to discuss moving forward with this approach to incumbent contractors?
Get their buy-in. How can we use their expertise to assist with this? Because it's not just we're going to put in a third-party product and bolt it onto their network and do it, but how are we going to use them to assist us in this? And what further upgrades, always talk the dollar, what further upgrades will you get down the track when we know what the data is from the building?
Scott from GPT?
Similar lines. I think you've got to foster a change management culture within that business. So you've got to take them on the journey and get them to, I guess, understand why it's important for us and therefore why it makes it relevant for them. And then I'd also think, you don't need to start like trying to solve the problems of the world, right, to begin with. I think, start with pilot projects to build that trust. I think it's important to build that trust. And you do that by starting small and then getting each party to see the benefit of it.
And Scott Beauman?
I'll take the opposite side of this argument. I actually think we need to be a bit tougher on this, right? Like, I think we all kind of agree that this is the way the industry is moving forward. And I think maybe it's time to tell people to get on board with it or start looking for something else, right? I think, the pilots are good, and, we've certainly done a lot of them, and a lot of them have been successful. A lot of them have had their challenges that we've kind of gone through today. But yeah, for me, it's, again, maybe a little bit biased. I think it's time we just, kind of really make a coordinated push, right? This is happening.
Always good to finish with a little bit of controversy and disagreement to keep everyone thinking. So I think that's been great. Look, we've only got a minute or so left. I just wanted to wrap things up and say, look, this has been a really fascinating discussion. It's really interesting because when we get down to this, we are talking about people, process, and technology, and how all these things interact. And we did talk a lot about, there was some talk there about networks and cybersecurity, and we threw in the ESG and all sorts of other things that came through in this discussion. But what it boils down to is that we're looking for technology that's going to save us money, increase efficiency, help us maintain those neighbours ratings and other factors that are important for ensuring that the tenants stay in buildings and that owners maximise their value. So it's been really fascinating to kind of talk around through a whole bunch of different topics to make that possible. I want to thank our three panelists for today. Thank you to Jeremy from JLL, Scott from GPT, and Scott from CIM. It's been great to have those different perspectives. I'm obviously talking about someone who's been at the coalface with Jeremy and Scott through GPT, and CIM obviously is a data analytics provider for buildings. After the webinar ends, there will be a short survey for everybody to fill in. So if you could please do that, we'd really, really appreciate it. It helps us hone what we do for future webinars. But with that, I want to wrap things up. I hope everyone has a great rest of the day. And for those that are catching up on this on the recording, make sure you tune in next time so that you can put your questions into the panelists for our next webinar. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.